Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. So I think you can hear me. Okay, that's good. So I want to talk about limitarianism, which is in a nutshell the idea that people can be too rich, that they can have too much wealth once they have more than a certain amount of wealth. And what I want to do today is just to introduce the idea to you and to think with you to sort of together about, well, is this a plausible view? If so, what shape could it take? I want to do that by focusing on the following things. So first, what is limitarianism? Like what's the kind of view? How do we conceptualize wealth? Why limitarianism? Why should we defend it? Do we have reasons to say that people can be too rich? How much is too much? I'll say a bit about that. So if you say, well, there is a wealth limit, how high would that threshold be? Well, when does someone have too much? How many euros or dollars does that take? And then some implications and discussion, which is basically a fairly random set of considerations, things that I was thinking about while preparing this PowerPoint, and things that might interest you as well. I would just welcome you to intervene, especially if something is unclear, because like was said, my background is in philosophy, which is a slightly different background than what most or perhaps all of you have. So there might be some sort of interdisciplinary unclarities in what I say, and just intervene, say so if there's something that is unclear, and I'm looking forward to this. So that's my plan. Okay, so Ingrid Robijns, a professor from Utrecht University, introduced limitarianism, the term, the view, and some arguments for that view. And in her article from 2017, she defines it as follows. In a nutshell, limitarianism advocates that it is not morally permissible to have more resources than are needed to fully flourish in life. Limitarianism views having riches or wealth to be the state in which one has more resources than are needed, and claims that in such a case one has too much, morally speaking. And so there are a number of elements in this definition that are important to point out, I think. The first is that it's about moral permissibility. Pointer doesn't really work on the screen. No, it does work there. It doesn't. The first is about the moral permissibility. So it's an ethical view. It's a view about how we're supposed to live or how society is organized. I'll say more about that. But it's a view about values. The second is that you can be a limitarian about a number of different things, right? So here the term resources is used, and I think wealth is a very important resource, but you might also be a limitarian about emissions, for instance, and say that people should only be allowed to have a certain amount of emissions over a lifetime or per year, and that it doesn't matter if they have less, it doesn't matter if there's inequality between people's emissions, as long as people don't exceed that threshold, they're good. If they do exceed it, then that is morally impermissible. So what I want to stress at the outset is that it's not, first of all, sort of a legal or fiscal theory about how the tax system should be designed, but it's a view about what people owe to each other in a society, in a just society or in a society like ours. I'll say more about the possible implications for taxes later, and that's also one of the things that I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on. Now, in a later paper, Robijns really focused on income and wealth as being the metric of limitarianism, if you want to put it in those terms. And that's what I'll use in this presentation. So I'll be talking about economic limitarianism, which is the view that if people exceed some particular wealth threshold, if they have more than a certain amount of wealth, then they are too rich. I'll leave the distinction between income and wealth for what it is for now. I think that the wealth category is more interesting than the income one, and one of the reasons is that wealth inequality is very big in the Netherlands, but also on a global level. And there are slightly different, I think, considerations at play when we think about income and wealth, but we can discuss those later. Now, some of you might be familiar with the view sufficientarianism, which is the idea that people should have enough. And you could be a sufficientarian in many different domains, so you can say that people should have enough to meet their basic needs. You could say that people should have enough to have their human rights secured. In political philosophy, people have also defended higher thresholds, such as the threshold above which people are content with what they have or cannot reasonably ask for more. So there are different ways of to be a sufficientarian. But I think the most common definition of sufficientarianism, especially outside of philosophy, uses this fairly low threshold, where we say, well, we should ensure that people can meet their basic needs, which is a sufficiency claim. And when they do that, either we have no further reasons to benefit them, or our reasons are weaker. Right? So sufficientarians say that basic needs have a particular very strong moral urgency. Folako and Dumitru, who work on limitarianism as well, say, well, limitarianism basically turns sufficiency on its head. So whereas instead of saying people should be able to to reach a certain threshold, what limitarians say is people shouldn't be allowed to exceed a certain threshold. Right? So it's not a claim about having enough, it's a claim about having too much. Now there is some philosophical jargon that I will quickly go over, because it might help to situate the kind of view limitarianism is within the different theories about value or principles about value that people might have. So first, it's an instrumental view. So the idea that people can have too much is not what in political philosophy would be called an intrinsic view. So it's not intrinsically wrong if people exceed a certain threshold, but it is instrumentally wrong because there are certain values at stake. I'll discuss some of them later, but for instance, political equality and being able to meet urgent needs are two very important things, I think. And the argument would be that if you care about those, then you have a reason to say that there should be a limit to wealth. Whereas if you're an egalitarian, for instance, and you believe that people are each other's equals, then you will probably say that egalitarianism is not an instrumental view, but an intrinsic view, because you care about equality as a value. Like, that's the thing that you're concerned with. But limitarianism is an instrument, which also means that if there is a better instrument, we no longer have a reason to defend limitarianism. And the second is that it's non-ideal, which is basically to say that it tries to offer guidance in the world as we know it, or as philosophers would say, in a world similar to ours, but not in very sort of utopia. It's not necessarily a utopian ideal about what heaven or the perfect just society looks like, but it's a view that aims to offer guidance in the here and now. It's a mid-level view, which means that it tries to say it doesn't really matter what you think that is ultimately valuable. So whether you think that ultimately we should care about equality or sufficiency or something else, for instance, distributing valuable scarce goods on the basis of merit or desert, it doesn't really matter where you stand on those, but we can all agree, or many people can agree that it would be a good thing to have limits to wealth. Right? So it's sort of in the mid-level between very fundamental normative principles and very specific principles such as income above a certain amount of money should be taxed at X%. And it's a partial theory, which basically means that limitarianism only says certain things about what we should aim for as a society, but not everything. So there might be things that you find valuable as well, such as that inequality below the wealth threshold isn't too big, or maybe that it can be big. But limitarianism is really focused on, okay, how should we think about wealth as a category? Okay, why limitarianism? So there's a lot of data that I could have mentioned, and in the train I realized that given that you're probably more data-oriented than most of political philosophy, I could have mentioned more, but I wanted to mention just two statistics. The first is from the Netherlands, where depending on how you calculate private wealth, so there's always a debate about pensions, depending on how you calculate that, the richest 1% of households own more than 25% of private wealth, which compared to other economies is relatively big. I think for this debate in particular, there are good reasons not to take pensions into account, because you cannot inherit a pension. And so if you think about how wealth accumulates over time and between generations, the pensions don't really have much of a role to play. And if you care about are people able to meet their basic needs in times of crisis, for instance, then pensions don't really help much. Even if I would be entitled to a large pension later, it doesn't help me if I'm currently in crisis. So in Dutch, government bodies often study what they call schokbestendigheid, which is the ability that households have if their income sort of falls away, if they receive lower income. How long can they last, basically, before they drop below some critical threshold. The global data is, of course, and you know that much better than I do, riddled with uncertainty and assumptions, but one of the reports that are often used in this context is the Global Wealth Report from Credit Suisse, I think, and they calculate that the richest 1% of the global population own roughly 50% of total private wealth. Different studies come with different findings, but sort of I think the margin that they have allows for sufficient, that we can say with sufficient confidence that the wealth inequality is really big. How you evaluate that in normative terms is a different question. So some people might say, well, 50%, it might sound like a lot, but it's fine normatively speaking. And so you need additional arguments if you want to say that it is too big or too small, or that the cake should be divided differently. My own interest in the sort of from political philosophy, the question why limitarianism is less data focused and more reason arguments focused. And I want to go over a couple of arguments that point in the direction of there should be limits to wealth. It's good to think about how we can limit wealth. The first is that it undermines what I call democratic institutions and the value of political equality. And that's also the first argument that Ingrid Robens used when introducing the view. So if you care about political equality, you might care about different things. So you might say it is good that people share power when making collective decisions, or you might say that collective decisions are better decisions, epistemically, that our collective decisions do something better than if individuals were to decide on these issues. Or you might say that a democracy is the place where people meet each other, exchange ideas, people with different backgrounds, different interests. And if there is political equality, then that means that people have the opportunity to form a community, to form a nation. And but no matter what you think about those things exactly, it's probably going to be very, if not of crucial importance, that there is some kind of equality in the political domain. And one way to say that is to say that every person's vote should weigh equally. And so the question is, well, what kind of distribution of wealth is compatible with that idea? In the Netherlands, scientists from Amsterdam, I forgot to put in the reference, they studied the relation or the correlation basically between the probability that your political preferences would actually be carried out by the government and what they found is that there is quite a correlation between how much money you have. They also focused on income, not just on wealth, and how likely it is that your political preferences will sort of be realized, or politicians will aim to realize them in the actual world. And which the question is always, of course, how much can you conclude from this? What explains this? But it suggests, I think, that when we think about wealth inequality, we might ask, well, is that compatible with political equality? Now, in the US, similar research has been done. And there's also a lot of interesting research, I think, on corporations and larger lobby organizations which put pressure on the idea that the current wealth inequality that we have is compatible with this ideal of political equality. Now, it's in the political philosophical debate relatively controversial we can conclude from this, because some people will just say, well, political equality is not that important. I won't be saying much about that here, but that just goes to show that from the fact that two things are incompatible with each other, we cannot necessarily conclude that wealth inequality is wrong. We also can't conclude from that limitarianism would be a good thing, but I think many people hold the intuition that, and I think there are good reasons for that, for saying that, well, at least some form of political equality is valuable and important, and if wealth inequality undermines that then that speaks against the inequality, and it speaks in favor of policies that aim to curb that. Now, the second argument is what Robins calls the unmet urgent needs argument. And basically what it says is that when we think about how resources, valuable, scarce resources are distributed, we want to achieve a number of things. And one of them is provide sufficiency of some sort. So if you think about basic needs, for instance, then the distribution of scarce resources should be such that it promotes benefiting people who cannot meet their basic needs. And the question is, well, If there are people who are very rich, how much value is there in allowing people to have that much wealth if there are also many people that live under some kind of poverty threshold? So in the Netherlands, there was a recent, relatively recent study which showed that 1 in 10 children grow up under a poverty threshold, which some people would say, well, on a global level, that's still a fairly high level. But that raises the question, well, is there a way in which we can benefit those? Because of the Corona crisis and the war in Ukraine, the number of people globally that live under the extreme poverty threshold is expected to rise again, and is actually rising, which again raises the question, well, how should we allocate resources in such a way that we can benefit the people that are worse off? Now, saying that there should be a cap on wealth, or that there should be some kind of wealth limit, is not very likely to solve all those problems, but it would be, I think, and I'll say more about that later when talking about how high should the threshold be. It would be a way of burdening people that have sort of strong enough shoulders, and be able to use that wealth, those resources, in order to address these unmet urgent needs. Now, one particular version of the unmet urgent needs argument could be a sort of a climate ethical argument for limitarianism, which can take various forms. So in climate ethics, there are many debates about how to allocate benefits and burdens. So how to ensure that when we transition into a new economy, but also when we adapt to a changing climate, who should benefit from this, who should be burdened with this, how do we allocate responsibility? And there are various principles that are often used, such as that polluters should pay, that people that can bear the costs should pay, even if they're not responsible, or that, for instance, we should take into account historical emissions and look at economies or people that have benefited from previous emissions to attain their wealth or to attain their high quality of life. And the idea would be that on the basis of those principles, you allocate responsibilities for burdens and benefits. Now, I think here's where limitarianism as a mid-level principle sort of becomes clear, because even though saying we should burden the rich doesn't sort of tell the full story about how responsibilities should be allocated, especially because many of us will have a very strong duty in order to lower our personal emissions as well. But many of these different principles point in the direction of, okay, here's at least one group of whom we can say with reasonable certainty that they have benefited from past emissions, for instance, because many people in the Forbes 500 list, for instance, benefited from emissions, either because of transportation costs or because they are heads or shareholders of large oil companies and so on. They have lifestyles that are known to be very high in terms of emissions, so if we want to make the polluters pay, then they have a strong reason to burden them. And even if they are sort of saintly, climate neutral, or even climate positive, lifestyleish people, they have the shoulders that can be burdened with certain kind of duties. And so I think that these different arguments all suggest that we have a climate ethics related reason to burden or to tax the richest people, which is not to say that would solve everything, but it does suggest that as a partial theory about how to move from where we are to a future that is more just, limitarianism could play a role. In public debate, but also in the philosophical debate, there's a lot of stuff on desert and merit as a justification for inequality. And so I think a very interesting question is, well, can we turn the desert argument around and see if it can justify these large inequalities in wealth? So if you read the bibliography of Steve Jobs, for instance, or any of the other sort of superstars in the tech world, then the story will often be that this is someone who had unique capabilities, like who was sort of had the unique ability to see futures that other people didn't see, to invent products that other people couldn't invent, and to also see sort of market opportunities that other people failed to see. And you'll find these in the tech world, but you'll find them everywhere, right? So in the Netherlands, Germany, US, every country has its own examples of entrepreneurs that became very rich, very wealthy, and are sometimes said to deserve their wealth. Now, in the philosophical debate on desert and merit, there's a very sort of extensive discussion about what exactly does it mean to deserve something. And I think it's very interesting to see that in that debate, people often link something that you end up deserving, wealth in this case, with a certain thing that can be contributed to you. Right? So something like purposeful effort is often mentioned. So if you do something, if you put in effort, that's not just, that actually has a certain purpose, so you're trying to achieve a certain goal, and you're the one trying to achieve that, and you end up with something that other people don't have. So because of that, inequality exists. Then in that debate, many people would say, well, that's the kind of inequality that we're okay with, even if it's relatively large. Right? That it can be justified on the basis of desert rather than on the basis of luck, for instance. So in the debate, people would say that if you inherit a small or a large inheritance, then that is undeserved because you didn't do anything for that. But if you're like Steve Jobs and you earned your wealth, or Bill Gates and you earned your wealth by being an entrepreneur and being very successful, then you are fully entitled to your wealth, which would speak against limitarianism, of course, because the idea would be that it is morally impermissible to have a certain amount of wealth, but the merit or desert argument might show that it's actually permissible in some cases. I think there are a number of considerations here. So the reason that I spent some time on this is because, especially in public discourse, desert arguments are very, very prominent. But I think that what you need to show if you want to make this kind of desert argument is not just that some people earn or deserve to have more than others, but also that you can justify the current wealth inequality. Because in the end, that's what we are interested in. We're interested in seeing whether the world as we know it is just on the basis of these arguments. And so if the merit argument is supposed to work, then we need to be able to justify the current inequality. And then it becomes very difficult to see how something like purposeful effort could work. So some people in the early days of the debate would say that if you work more hours than someone else, then the inequality that results from that is fine. But that's very unlikely to sort of justify these large inequalities because there's only so many hours that you can work more than someone else. But the same is probably true for purposeful effort, or for sort of the added value as an individual that you have and that can be contributed to you. Because if we cannot make this contribution, if we cannot show that it's actually your distinctive desert, then the justification doesn't work anymore, because it would be more like an inheritance where you end up with a lot of wealth that you didn't deserve. So the question is, I think, for limitarianism, well, is there a point at which we can say, well, having so much more than someone else simply cannot be justified on the basis of desert anymore? So even if we say that wealth inequality can be justified on the basis of desert, there might be limits to how large that inequality can be. And I think that point sort of gives you a different reason for limitarianism, at least for a more egalitarian distribution. The question is whether this desert argument gives you a clear limit, but I think that that's true for all of these arguments, whether the idea of political equality translates into a limit of so much billion or $1 million, or if it's a bit more subtle. But I think that even if you say that we should protect and secure inequalities on the basis of merit and desert, then still there's a very reasonable debate to be had about how much inequality could this justify. And so I had an argument number 5, which is the unknown argument. Because there are many other arguments that people have proposed or come up with in this debate, you might think of one as well, which you're sort of free to add. But I think that these are the most prominent ones. So the idea that we should protect political equality, the idea that like large fortunes are wasteful from a societal perspective if there are other goods, important values that we can or need to secure. If we think about climate change, and if we think about this more moral argument about desert, which in political philosophy is getting quite some attention because the desert literature is very important when thinking about, well, what are people entitled to? Does it matter what they do, which choices they make, and so forth. Is this so far it's followable. That isn't the word in English. Okay. So why limitarianism? Now the question is, so maybe you disagree at this point, we can talk about that later, but let's assume there is some reason, so we have some sort of support for a wealth limit. How high could that be? Now, as we saw in the quote in the beginning, Ingrid Robijns talks about the fully flourishing life, which isn't just a philosophical idea about flourishing, but she does give some way of calculating how much that could be. It's in the paper Having Too Much. I have the references on the last slide, so I can send them to you. But the idea would be that you look at the kind of life that someone can have, the things that they could achieve if they wanted to, and the things that they actually have access to. And then you look at how much wealth people need in order to live that kind of life. And so the question is, well, what can people reasonably demand? Right? So having a house above your head is something that you can demand. Having a slightly larger house might also be something that you can demand. But having 5 or 6, like, there might be limits to how much we can reasonably say, well, I should be able to have this. And the same could be true for other kinds of capabilities or functionings, or however you want to define them. And then the question is, well, is there a point at which we can say, well, you have so much wealth that you can buy or have everything that you can reasonably demand to buy or have, and therefore having more is morally impermissible. There were some empirical studies to a richest line. I want to mention 2, also because these are the only 2 that I'm familiar with, but you might know more. The first is done by Robijns and some other scholars in Utrecht under the Dutch population, which was a vignette study where people were asked to look at, I think, 10 different possible households, ranging from no car, renting a house, having almost no personal wealth, and so on, to having millions on the bank, 2 houses, 5 holidays a year, and 2 cars and 1 Ferrari, I think. So, and then the people were asked, well, is there a household of which you would say that having more would not benefit people in a morally significant sense? Which is asking for a descriptive richest line. Right, so you're asking, well, can you, just as the idea of sufficiency, so there's a lot of research on what does it mean to meet your basic needs, can we also come up with a richest line where we would say that having more doesn't make your life better, or doesn't make the life of this household better? They then calculated the amount of money that you needed for the vignette that over 66% of the respondents said which sort of could serve as a richest line, and that point was 2.2 million. So the idea, and the data is from 2017, the idea would be that if you have 2.2 million, then having more wealth, according to this study, doesn't make your life better in a morally significant sense. But that's a descriptive line. What's interesting is that people didn't say, well, that means that people shouldn't have more. So if you have more than that, you do not have too much. You just have more than you could possibly need. In that same study, people were also asked to make decisions between either, for instance, having more taxes on the rich or cutting in public provision. And then people do use that richest line as a point where they say that, well, once you have more money than that amount of money, given that there is not much to gain from you, it's more important that we can provide these public goods, and therefore it's justified if you're sort of having to pay more taxes, for example. But the idea of a descriptive richest line in and of itself being the point above which people have too much, that's something that many people rejected. In that study, 96% of the people said that there is a richest line, so some people thought there was much higher, but it was interesting to see, I think, that the idea of a richest line can be conceptualized by people, descriptively. Davis et al. There was a study in London where different groups of people were brought together to think about wealth, what it means to be wealthy. And they were thinking about the kind of life that you need. So these are all sort of interviews that were done in a very complex way that I can't reproduce as a philosopher. But they concluded that the richest line should be much higher. So their descriptive richest line, if you were looking purely at the number, was somewhere in the region of 70 million pounds, which is substantially higher than the 2.2 in the Netherlands. But there again, it was interesting to see that just as the ideas of poverty or a minimal threshold can play a role in the way people think about distributive questions, so too can a richest line, even though the threshold really diverge. And it would, of course, be interesting, I think, to see, well, are there more studies that we can do in order to test people's intuitions or views about this? From a normative point of view, it's always very difficult to conclude what follows from this. So it might be that people are wrong. If you have a view about ethics that says that there are certain truths about how society should be organized, then if people have different intuitions, it's just too bad for their intuitions. So in the debate on limitarianism, there's also a question about, well, what can we use? What does this data really tell us? But that's also something, I think, for you to discuss. So the difference between the descriptive and the normative richest line is, I think important, where you can see in these, at least in these two studies, that people can describe a richest line, even though it doesn't always have these normative implication of moving from having enough to having too much. There are also some more normative proposals which don't really give you a specific number, but a kind of value or right or kind of life that the richest line is supposed to protect. So one of them, like I said, is from Ingrid Rowijns, who says people should be able to live a fully flourishing life. When they have more resources than are needed for that kind of life, they have too much. Danielle Zwarthout defends the threshold of full autonomy. So her argument is that once people have more than a certain amount of wealth, then that actually hampers their autonomy. And if you care about autonomy, then you should care about people not having too much wealth. And one of the arguments that she uses, for instance, is that if you have a very luxurious lifestyle, that actually means that you have fewer real opportunities because you need to sustain that lifestyle in order to, relate to your friends, be able to hang out with the people that you want to hang out with, be able to consume in the way that you want to consume. And she says that, well, above a certain point, having more wealth basically locks your opportunities. Now, what's I think important to note about these kinds of arguments is that Rowijns' argument is different. So the flourishing view that she defends is supposed to be a sort of a political conception of the good life, if you will, that people collectively agree on as being sort of a reasonable life that people should be able to strive for, and above which wealth is too much. Whereas Zwarthout's account is more sort of directly ethical. Let's see, there's a wrong bracket there. Sort of an ethical view about what it means to live a good life that doesn't really consult the general public, but it just says, here is a view about autonomy, and here is what that means for the distribution of money. So there are different ways of doing this. I myself am more interested in the fully flourishing version, so arguments that look at, well, what could be a public conception of wealth that we can agree on, just as in the basic needs debate, this is often what people do, where people are asked, well, what is the minimally good life, if you want to put it in those terms? Is there a public conception of that we can use as a measurement for what people owe to each other in society or on a global level? But you might have different inclinations. So you might just say, no, there is something that is distinctively good life, and for that life you cannot have more than a certain amount of money, therefore we should be limitarians. In political philosophy, these are often called perfectionist views because they say that the goal or aim of society should be to promote a certain kind of life and not a different kind of life. Whereas the flourishing life and views with that structure are more liberal views that try to say, well, here's a life that we collectively can agree on is valuable. What I try to do is to define the threshold not in terms of the kind of life that you can live, but the kind of considerations at stake. So you can also think of the distributive questions as questions where people with different interests and different backgrounds make a claim to a shared resource, in this case the amount of wealth that we have. And some people might say, well, I cannot meet my basic needs, so therefore I should have more. Others might say, I work really hard, a lot of hours, therefore I should have more. And so the idea of a wealth limit could be that you say, well, it should be at the point where your claim to having more wealth can no longer outweigh the claims of others, right? So that would be a shift in reasons, if you will, where beyond that point there can at least be certain circumstances in which you can be entitled morally to having more, but above a certain point that no longer holds. So above that point, it will always be the case that other societal goods or other people's needs or interests have more normative weight than yours. So So these are just different ways to think about the wealth threshold, which I just sort of present here, and obviously because I came up with the third one, like that's where my sort of inclination would be. But you can perfectly think of the flourishing life and also as the autonomous life as a way of trying to capture that, right? So where you say, well, a fully flourishing life, that's the kind of life that you can be entitled to or that you can strive for. But once you want more resources than are needed to live such a life, then your claim to wealth, given scarcity of resources and given the other societal challenges that we face, will just not have enough normative weight. And that might be true even if your life could be better. Right, so you might say, well, above a certain point, your life simply won't get any better if you have more wealth. Or you might say, well, it could be better, but it's just not important enough that your life will go better. And there are some dots there because there are many different ways in which you can think about this, these normative proposals, and you might have other ideas about how to conceptualize this. Okay, then implications and discussion. So the first thing to note is that if you're a limitarian, you might actually defend different thresholds. So you might say, well, there's a threshold on an individual level which tells you, for you in your specific life, given your specific views about what's good and valuable, how much money you need for that. And then if you have more wealth than that, then sort of from an ethical point of view, you could say, well, I have too much, so I will give it away or do something else with it. Which isn't to say that you believe that everyone else should stick to the same threshold. Right? So you can perfectly say, well, what's enough for me might not be enough for others, and that's fine, but on my sort of in my life, I am a limitarian in the sense that I think that I don't need more than a certain amount of money. The kind of limitarianism that I'm most interested in takes a more institutional or public form, where we say, well, it's not so much about individuals and what they think, it's about our collective conception of what society should look like, the kind of future that we should aim to realize, and what role wealth and wealth inequality can play in that kind of world. And so the limit will guide not necessarily individual behavior, but it will guide institutional design and policy making. And then it might be true that you think that you have too much, even though sort of the general public doesn't think that that's the case. It may also be true that you think that you should have more. So maybe the public threshold would be at the 2.2 million from the Dutch study, and you think that you need at least 10 or 50, then in the philosophical jargon, people would say that you're being unreasonable. So you're asking for more than you can reasonably ask for. But if you can be a limitarian in the individual domain or in the public domain or both. And I'm just focusing on wealth here, but again, you can also think of be a limitarian in the sort of the emissions domain or how many children you should have. Or there are different goods that could be regulated by limits. And that's true both for the individual and the collective domain. There might be other aspects, so if you think of the individual sphere and the public sphere, you might also think of the private sphere with shareholders and so on that may also be guided by limitarian principles, values, ideas. That would be another place where limitarian principles would play a role. The second point is that limitarianism, because it is, like I said in the beginning, a mid-level and instrumental view, is compatible with various different ideas about how to organize society and how to distribute wealth or other benefits and burdens below the wealth threshold. Right? So you might actually be very inequality tolerant and believe that even large inequalities can be perfectly fine in different domains, in the domain of wealth, maybe in the domain of access to healthcare or education, and still think that there's a certain limit to the size of that inequality. Or you might say, well, I actually don't really need the limitarian threshold because I'm an egalitarian. I care about inequality in all these different domains, and so if there is some kind of inequality, that will already be likely to be too much for me. Right? But these are just very different views that you could have. You might also say, well, below that point, we're only going to use this principle of merit or desert, or you might say below the point we only care about equality of opportunity or something. These are all principles that are compatible with limitarianism. And so you can be end up with very different complete views, if you want to call it that way, which can be which could all be compatible with the idea of wealth limits. And so that's basically the second part. The first part is that there might be very different ways in which we can implement wealth limits. So you might think of taxing inheritance and gifts as a way of taxing wealth, preventing the accumulation of wealth over time. And there may be good reasons for that, such as that these kinds of taxes tend to be less disruptive than actual wealth taxes, or that you think it's an easier tax base or something. Or maybe that you think that we should make sure that people can get what they deserve and inheritance are not deserved, so you have a more moral argument. And if you have that kind of view, then limitarianism will happen via these taxes on inheritances and gifts. But you might also have different views about how to implement the sort of limitarian ideal. And so I have to say that here, this is really where in the political philosophy often where people get to the boundaries of the research field, because much is about the normative justification and principles and values that underlie both the arguments in favor and against limitarianism. But when it comes to institutional design, that's something that I think where people could really benefit from interdisciplinary collaboration. And so I would also be very happy and interested to hear your thoughts on this. Now, a different argument for or against limitarianism is the idea of philanthropy, right? So especially so Bill Gates is probably the most famous example of this. But if you think about the super rich, then you might say, well, yes, surely there are people that do wrong stuff with their money or they don't benefit society. Maybe that's true for most of them, but there are at least some people who really do good things. And they might be more effective and more efficient than governments in that regard. So there's an interesting debate about the value of philanthropy, both in terms of its normative justification, so maybe you believe that people should be able to do with their money what they want, or in terms of effectiveness. So if you care about eradicating poverty, for instance, especially on a global scale, then some people would say that it's actually private individuals rather than states that are going to be the most effective. And the reason for that is that private individuals do not have to take into account in their decision making all of the democratic political things that government bodies need to. So I think that's a very interesting case for and against limitarianism, where we might ask, well, given that your goal is, or one of the goals is to promote the provision of basic needs, can't that actually provide a justification for limitarianism? And I think on the one hand, the answer to this is empirical, right? So we need to study at how effective billionaires are, not just the good ones, the philanthropists, but also the others. So that's an empirical question that I have to say I'm not sufficiently familiar with. So I've been trying to read up on this literature, and I read different things. And so that's something that I want to dive into further myself. But there is also a different argument, I think, in the concept of philanthropy, which has to do mostly with the political equality argument, which is, well, do we want it to be the case that people, for their basic needs, are dependent on philanthropists? And so that's more of a normative question, which might go against the empirical one. So it could be that philanthropists are very effective in eradicating basic needs, but at the same time, it might be true that we believe that in the provision of basic needs, people should rely or be dependent on public institutions that are responsive to the needs and the will of its citizens. And so I think the philanthropy case is a really tricky one for limitarianism, because some of the arguments that limitarians defend speak in favor of some of the actions by philanthropists, whereas the idea that people should be equals and the idea that people should be able to form or influence the kind of world they live in might actually speak against them. In the Netherlands and also in Germany after that, there was a very interesting case of a Dutch billionaire, a tech billionaire, who donated over $1 million to two political parties in the Netherlands and then to the Greens in Germany in the later elections, because he said that they were the parties that had the best sort of green climate plans and ideas. And so that raises a very interesting question, I think, especially if you care about the climate as an argument. Well, is this the kind of use of wealth that we want to have in society? And I think the answer is no, but there are people who disagree with this, who say, well, it's not like that he's the only person in this case investing money in political campaigns, so you maybe there's no way around doing this if you want to be effective. But I think that's a very interesting example where you can see, I think, clearly a threat to political equality, because not all of us are able to just pay this amount of money to influence a political campaign. But on the other hand, there are certain goals that libertarianism is trying to achieve, and given that it's not an intrinsic view, so given that libertarians, maybe that would be different for Daniel Zwarthout, who has the autonomy argument, but if you have this political view about wealth limits, you're not saying that it's intrinsically wrong or bad if people have more than a certain amount of wealth, but it's instrumentally wrong. Given that it's only instrumentally wrong, then maybe libertarianism does more harm than good in this specific case. And so I think that's a very interesting, these are sort of philanthropy and the spending on political campaigns are very interesting examples, especially in Europe, where it's relatively uncommon for this to happen out in the open. I think in the US it's much clearer that the bads outweigh the goods, but that's an interesting example. And from a more purely political, philosophical point of view, it's interesting, I think, to see or to think about whether it matters if you're trying to influence the politics of the country in which you're allowed to vote, rather than a country where you're not allowed to vote. Because at least as far as I know, this billionaire was allowed to vote in the Netherlands, but not in Germany. But in terms of trying to influence political campaigns with wealth, it doesn't matter, because you can donate that money anyway. That's all I have. So I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. And so here are some references, and there's I'm sort of, how do you say that in English? I have a libertarianism bibliography, so whenever a new article comes out, I try to add that and try to keep it up to date, so I can send you the slides. If you're interested, then you can find the literature there. Some of that is really articles long on libertarianism, others is a bit more shorter, sort of sections of chapters, but that should give you a rough overview of what's out there.